has posted this in the chat room. So thank you very much for that. The information about NAMEPA that I want to get to is, and you're going to be hearing this frequently through this event, is that NAMEPA has been nominated for the Green for Sea Innovation Award, which is, once we've made the shortlist, which we have, becomes a beauty contest, and it's based on nominations. So vote early and vote often. You can vote every day for NAMEPA, because we have been nominated for our CSR ESG Maritime Sustainability Passport Program, and we need your vote. So get out and vote. I also want to thank our sponsors. We are so grateful to our sponsors who have signified their commitment to NAMEPA and our mission to save our seas. And their contribution is what is making today possible, as well as our ongoing work. So I think we're going to see our sponsor slide next. And we will see it at some, there we go. And there's our sponsor slide. So ABS, Blank Room, Dorian, DNVGL, the American Club, Fairfield Chemical Carriers, Hudson Analytics, Morgan Marketing, Purify Fuels, Scorpio, West Gulf Maritime Association, Resolve Marine, and Smith. Thank you all for your support of today's event. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to a man who needs very little introduction. That is our chairman of NAMEPA, Joe Hughes, who is also the CEO and president of the American Club. So Joe, take it away. Joe, we need to unmute you. Just a second. You're being brilliant, but right now your event.
Right. Okay.
There you go. You're muted again, Joe.
I've tried to.
There you go.
Have you got me now?
We do. Thank you.
I hope that is not intent. That's not an omen that there is some power wishing me to be muted. But anyway, thank you very much indeed for the introduction, Carleen. It's certainly a pleasure to stage this conference today in rather different circumstances, I must say, than we had the pleasure of holding it last year in Houston. And I remember that occasion very, very well. It seemed like a lifetime ago, but really it was just under 12 months ago that we held our customary operations seminar in late February, early March. But as I say, this time we're going virtual. We've had a couple of other virtual conferences over the last several months that I think have gone very well, and I trust that today's event will be similarly successful. And that success, of course, is predicated upon your presence and your attendance here. So many, many thanks to all of you. We'll be hearing from some formidable minds over the next several hours on the issue of operations in a thoroughly disrupted world. And I think we can all agree that short of world war, the last 12 months have been the most thoroughly disrupted in living memory, quite frankly. And it is remarkable, really, that we've been able to continue as we have been able to continue over this period. From the shipping industry's perspective, of course, I mean, the overarching disruption has been that in relation to crewing, switching crews, and having the opportunity of giving seafarers the chance to go home from their service at sea. This has been a humanitarian crisis of a very considerable magnitude. And in fact, I think that much as the shipping industry most of the time doesn't attract that much attention from the general press across the world, I think that our seafarers, be they on large cruise ships or be they on tankers or bulk carriers or container ships or whatever, have in fact drawn a great deal of large international public attention to their plight. And That, of course, amongst other things, has led to the Neptune Declaration and statements from the shipping industry quite rightly that this situation concerning crews is untenable and must be resolved. I think progress has been made to some extent. People that I talk to in the ship operating sector indicate that there are signs of improvement, but the overall position is by no means satisfactory in that connection. And let us hope that the Neptune Declaration and other initiatives being taken in that respect will have some genuinely sustainable fruit from the point of view of seafarer well-being over the weeks and months ahead. But in other than that, I mean, and obviously the financial implications that have applied to certain sectors of the industry, I think the shipping community at large can congratulate itself on having been pretty successful in its resilience to these deeply different and perplexing circumstances in which it's found itself over the recent past. The supply chains, by and large, have been kept open. As I say, much of that is due to the fact that the seafarer has had to maintain his or her work in an uninterrupted fashion over the last year or so. But I think that the resiliency and the agility of the industry in general in being able to respond to these very difficult circumstances is worth noting and is worth a form of congratulation. I think the other thing that's happened to all of us in our different avenues of life has been how a lot of the transitional events that were bound to occur over and into the near future, over the recent past and into the near future, have in fact occurred very much more quickly than perhaps we would have expected them to take place in more normal circumstances. Clearly, the advantages of modern technology, the wizardry of modern IT, is such that we have been able, in terms of operating our businesses, to keep in contact with each other to an extent that would have been possible even 10 years ago, probably, and yet is made possible by virtue of advances in technology. You could say also that the decarbonisation initiatives of the recent past may have gained a degree of impetus by virtue of recent events and the effect that it has had upon the world as a whole. Sustainability, I think, has become much more front and center in the recent past by virtue of the difficulties which we all face now and the recognition that the planet on which we live and our life on this planet is very fragile, actually, and that therefore, in everything that we do in living our lives, the importance of sustainability has never been greater. And it's really come front and center, I think, over the last period. So you will, of course, be hearing from some very considerable expert opinion on the issues of marine operations as such, and in particular with the very logical progression of where we are now, where we need to go, and what tools we need to have to hand in order to get us to our intended destination. So with that in mind, and just as I say, with a special thought to the seafarer in these very difficult circumstances and the hope that things will improve, and that indeed, from our point of view here today, we will in fact be celebrating this event in person in 12 months' time, rather than through this virtual format. I will now go to ask Randy Gibbons, who's the Senior Vice President of Equity Research at Jefferies, to give us an insight into the current state of the market. Randy.
Hey, Joe. Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. All right. Well, yeah, the state of the market today, obviously, marine operations in a disrupted world. For those of you who have been around shipping for quite some time, it really has been a tale of 2 decades, right? But at least in this century. So 2000 to 2010, very much a boom. 2010 to 2020, somewhat of a bust, right? So now we want to look at where the roaring 2020s are going to lead us to. So if you can go to the next slide here, we will look at a few of the different industries, the subsectors within shipping, right? Shipping is a big umbrella. We here at Jefferies, the Senior Vice President and Equity Analyst of Maritime Shipping at Jefferies, covering 32 different shipping names, right? From crude tankers and products tankers to LNG carriers and LPG carriers to dry bulk and container ships. So we cover a pretty large gambit of the shipping industry. Now, we'll touch on a few here, just kind of showing the tale of 2 decades, and then we'll get into each of the subsectors and then a look ahead as well. So when you look at 2000 to 2010, for pretty much all industries, it was marked by very robust demand growth, as you can see for the most of the left side of this chart here on the crude tanker ton mile demand, followed by a pretty weak demand, or at least volatile demand, the next decade. Similarly, on the supply side of the equation, very low supply growth from 2000 to 2010. You had a huge transition from single hull vessels to double hull vessels, right? As well as you didn't have the ordering spree, the shipyard capacity build out, the European banks and other private equities flooding the space, which you did have from 2008, let's call it, until really today, right? So as you can tell in this chart on the right here, which you'll see in a few charts ahead, supply growth was very low in the first decade, pretty high in the most recent decade. And now we'll look ahead into the 2020s and see how that compares. But first, if you can flip the slide, we'll look at dry bulk, I believe is, this is a great visual on what has happened. So if you look on the left chart, that dot of 2000, right, is in the bottom right corner. That's where you want the industry to be from a supply perspective if you want to see healthy rates, right? Low order book, old average fleet age. As the first decade progressed, you see that plot go up and to the left. The order book was rising, newer and newer vessels were getting delivered, so that average fleet age was decreasing. And then everything inverted from 2010 to 2020, right? We started the last decade, 2010, let's call it, very high order books, very young fleet age, and that has progressively shrunk the order book as the age has progressively gotten older in recent years, with the ordering slowing. Obviously, that is pushing up the average fleet age as well as reducing the order book. So if you can turn to the next slide, we'll see a similar picture here on dry bulk, right? The first half of, or the first decade of the century was robust. China joined the WTO. You had a massive super cycle in commodities, right? Then 2008-9 was the blip. 2010 had some, but really the following 7 to 8 years have been kind of subdued. On the supply side, similarly, what we saw in tankers, very low fleet growth for the first decade and relatively high fleet growth in the second decade. So if you look on the next slide, you'll see a similar scatter plot here of what has happened with the supply picture in terms of the average fleet age and the order book. Similar story, a little more clumped together than tankers, but again, in 2000, low order book, old age. 2010, much higher order book, younger age. Now, when you get to 2020 on the right-hand chart, very low order book, arguably the lowest in 20 years. Now, the average fleet age is still relatively young because of all the deliveries that came in 2015, 16, 17, 18. But still, we're in a good shape on the order book side. And lastly, just looking at LNG on the next slide, you'll see a similar story, right, where demand was very strong in the first decade, pretty choppy in the second decade. Same thing on the supply growth in the first decade versus the second. You really see a ramp up there. And then again, on the next slide, on the scatter plot, you'll see a similar story, 2000 in the left-hand chart, down and to the right where you want to be. Obviously, it got way to the left, obviously, as vessels were delivered and that average fleet age decreased. And then in recent years, it stayed pretty tight in terms of where the order book is and where the average fleet age is. So let's briefly run through a quick summary of some of the sectors, and then we'll get to where we are today and looking ahead. So on the next slide, we're going to start with crude tankers. There's really a handful of demand drivers. A lot of it is inventory levels, which you'll see are very elevated, right? You had this surge in early 2000 that was just, incredible. And obviously that has started to come off in terms of the inventory levels as of late, as you start to see some inventory drawdown, production's been less, demand is starting to pick up. And again, in that top right chart, you'll see the massive reduction in oil demand that happened as a result of COVID-19, right? Second quarter of 2020, look at the million per barrel per day on global oil demand was 82 million barrels per day, something like this in the second quarter. Now that has rebounded dramatically in subsequent quarters, but even still, the forward outlook is still expecting global oil demand to be below where it was pre-COVID levels until at least 2022. However, inventory levels are being drawn down, and you are going to see some increasing production from OPEC and others here in 21 versus 20. If you go to the next slide on supply, you'll see a very attractive outlook, right? Look at that order book to fleet ratio in the top right corner, very low, again, lowest in decades. The outlook for supply growth is very minimal as well. We're looking at only 2% growth this year and next year. So all that being said, the fleet is relatively unlikely to grow significantly in the coming years due to this lack of new build ordering. And this is the same for all the subsectors, so I'll just say it in advance. You had capacity, shipyard capacity reduced relative to where it was a handful of years ago. You have capital, the availability of capital, much lower now as European banks are shedding some shipping exposure, private equity, Brexit, right, is happening. They're leaving the space. So, and you have these uncertainty around further regulations, IMO 2030 and whatnot, that are keeping owners at bay from ordering ships. So this is a great illustration. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see it just kind of numerically. And really, a lot of numbers here. Just look at the green box, right? The green box is what matters. 2021 and 2022, we expect a shortage of tankers. We expect demand to outpace supply growth. And as you'll be looking at the green boxes in subsequent slides, you'll see a very consistent trend. 2000 had a massive oversupply, but 2020 did, whereas 21 and 22, we're expecting shortages. And again, economics 101, when you have a shortage of tankers, of dry bulk carriers, of LNG ships, of container ships, you're going to have an improved rate environment, improved earnings environment, improved industry for all of us, right? So let's quickly go to refined products tankers, and you'll see a similar story here on the demand side. Inventory levels were very high pretty much throughout 2020 as you had a surge in inventories and floating storage and all of these things because demand really fell off the table if you look at that top right chart, and it's starting to come back now. But again, until you really get a lot of the COVID vaccines and people flying again and traveling, demand's not going to be where it was at the pre-COVID levels. Now, you are seeing some new refinery capacity additions displacing current refineries in the U.S. Gulf and Europe and being built in Asia, being built in the Middle East, which should help refined product tanker demand, right? If the U.S. and Europe need more diesel, gasoline, and jet fuel, they'll have to import it from further away distances because the local domestic refineries are closing. That should be a boon for the products tankers. Same thing on the next slide on the supply picture, very similar to crude tankers, very low order book, very low net supply growth. Again, maybe 3% this year down to 1.3% next year. Very low order book to fleet ratio, 25 years. So similar to crude tankers, we expect very limited fleet growth in the next couple of years. And again, on the next slide, you'll see the green box, which is key, is the shortage that you'll see here, where demand is set to outpace supply. There it is. Flipping slides again, we'll look over at LNG carriers. Now, LNG carrier demand, it's twofold, right? One is the liquefaction facilities. You know, everyone's heard here in the U.S. of Sabine Pass and Corpus Christi on Cheniere side, as well as Freeport LNG and Cameron LNG, right? But also in Australia, you had Gladstone, Wheatstone, Gorgon all ramping up in the last 5 to 6 years. Qatar is really starting to expand again. So one, you need supply of LNG. The other is you need demand for LNG. And those are the two charts at the bottom, right? Supply of LNG is set to grow as new liquefaction capacity comes online. Demand for LNG is also set to grow as regasification capacity comes online, right? You need regasification to take that LNG, regas it into natural gas, and then use it for power generation, industrial use. Now, if you look on the next slide, this order book is obviously higher than the tankers, but there's a few caveats to that. One is the vast majority of these orders are paired against those liquefaction facilities that are coming online, not many speculative orders. Secondly, this order book extends into 2025. Unlike the other shipping sectors where it only takes 18 to 24 months to build, so when you order it, you want it relatively soon, some of these LNG ships that are on order are going out to 2025, right? So people are ordering it now to be delivered 3-4 years from now. And obviously only 6 shipyards are building these things globally, so the order book is certainly going to be stretched out. Now, if you go to the next slide, you'll see, again, the green chart. We're going to have a shortage, slight shortage of ships, maybe one this year and a few more next year. Again, that should boost utilization and LNG shipping rates. Now, again, looking at LPG, similar story on the demand fundamentals. On the next slide, here we go. If you see that LNG seaborne trade, even in 2020, it ticked up ever so slightly in a terrible year, right? 2021 and 22 are set to grow much better, basically at GDP growth, plus a little bit, 5 and 4%. And that chart on the right, there's an invisible red line, not sure what happened there, but that is continuing to go up and to the right? U.S. production of propane and propylene continues to ramp, and so do the exports. So if you go down to the next slide here on the supply growth, similar story, you had a surge in new build ordering in 2014, 15, 16, as you can see on that top right chart. But since then, there haven't really been many new builds ordered. As a result, the order book to fleet ratio is very low. We're talking 14, 15% compared with 25 to 30% over a 5 or 10-year average, resulting in net fleet growth of 4% maybe this year, 3% next year. So on the next slide, you'll see the green box. What do you know? Another shortage of ships. Good for utilization, good for rates. Now, if we flip over to dry bulk, we'll run through these next two relatively quickly. Chinese iron ore inventory demand, Chinese iron ore inventories is very low relative to where it's been in recent years. If you can see kind of off the charts to the left there, that the inventory levels are very low, and your imports, especially in Asia, especially in China, are very high. They want to and need to produce steel. They need to import iron ore to do so. So again, we think dry bulk commodity growth should improve. On the supply side, very low. We're talking order book to fleet of 5.8%. That is the lowest since the early 1990s, right? We're talking 30 years ago. So again, very low fleet growth here, less than 2% both this year and next. And on the next slide, green box, another shortage, right? Massive shortage this year and next year. And you've already seen that. You've seen the forward freight agreements. You've seen charter rates starting to tick up in dry bulks. And then finally on container ships, the hottest sector of all, especially over the last 6 months. If you have $500 a month to spend on kind of disposable income, discretionary spending, and you're not traveling, you're not going to sporting events, you're not going to concerts, what are you doing? You're buying furniture, you're buying clothes, you're buying widgets, Pelotons, whatever, you name it, from Amazon and from China, right? So the Asia imports into Europe, Asian imports into the US are surging. As a result, you have very low idle fleet capacity, you have very high rates. If you can see, that red line is just up and to the right. And then if you look over to the left, it's kind of missed there almost, but it's stable. That green line is stable, obviously, as the container rates are very high. It costs a lot to import, and that is great for the container liners as well as the container ship owners. On the next slide, you'll see again, very attractive supply picture. Order book to fleet is the lowest in decades. We're talking 1980s, right? 30 to 40 years. Again, very small fleet growth here, 3% this year, maybe 1.5% next year. A lot of the order book is really on these very large container ships. So again, a dearth of capacity coming. And as a result, on the next slide, you'll see another shortage in the green box. In the final few minutes here, let's look at equities and look at kind of what's going on. But first, we'll talk about IMO 2020 and beyond, right? Everyone's heard of IMO 2020 by now. It was the topic du jour in 2019 and for the first quarter of 2020 before COVID came and said, it's our turn, right? Get away, IMO 2020. But before that, IMO 2020 was what everyone was talking about. That was the cap on the sulfur content of fuel, taking it from 3.5% to 0.5%. A lot of ship owners called scrubbers, a lot didn't. They just opted for the higher quality, higher cost fuel, VLSFO, it's called, very low sulfur fuel oil. Now in IMO 2030, that's kind of the next step to really reduce carbon emissions in across the shipping industry by 40% compared to 2008 benchmark levels. Now, there's a few ways to reduce your carbon emissions. One is obviously through new fuel or engine efficiencies, right? You've seen a lot of these LNG kind of dual fuel orders for container ships, for VLCCs, what have you even. But also, the easiest way is just to slow down the vessels. Stop going so fast, right? And that is going to be a great development for the shipping industry as a whole, because now if you slow down your speed, your effective fleet capacity is going to be reduced dramatically. If your effective fleet capacity and supply is going to be reduced and demand is stable, that means you can start charging more for the same tonnage. And again, IMO 2050, we're reducing it even further, right? Really reducing the greenhouse gas emissions as well. And then who knows, IMO 2100, not sure it's going to be relevant to myself, but maybe to my children. That is reducing emissions by the shipping industry to 0. So lofty goals, but we're headed in that direction. Now, lastly, with equities, what has happened over the last handful of years? You know, you've seen some fits and starts in the last, this shows the last 5 years here, right? 2016 was a pretty good year. 2017 was relatively flat. 2018, relatively lower. 2019 was great, right? You had a lot of people talking in the optimism of IMO 2020, as I mentioned. You had very strong rate environment for tankers and LNG carriers and dry bulks, pretty much across the board. Started the year very strong. Look at the start of January 2020, that peak there on the kind of right quartile of that chart. But then that 5-letter word, COVID, came and really disrupted the market, right? Obviously, that sold off everything. People just sold now, ask questions later. Things just got to ridiculously oversold levels. Stayed there for 5 or 6 months until November, until you've seen this rotation from momentum growth names into economically sensitive, energy-related, global trade-driven value stocks. That is shipping to a T. So all that being said, as we just looked at, the supply-demand fundamentals look very attractive. Capacity discipline is there. Owners aren't just going on these ordering sprees. You're going to start to see some kind of discipline there from an ordering perspective. Demand is set to continue to improve. As a result, we are very optimistic here. I joined Jefferies in 2011, so it's been a relatively rough but fun, but rough decade over the last 10 years. Pretty optimistic on the next 10, right? And I plan on being around for it. So with the supply-demand fundamentals being what they are, with a lot more eyeballs and inflows in terms of investments into the space and into these subsectors, we might not see the boom of 2000 and 2010, but it should be a lot better than what we saw in 2010 to 2020, right? So we're pretty bullish on the roaring 20s, and that's our story, and we're sticking to it. So thanks again for having me. Looking forward to the rest of the conference.
Well, thank you very much, Randy. And that was a terrific overview, although my head's spinning because there's so much information packed in there and so many implications for our industry, as well as for marine operations. We're next going to move into where we are today. And our moderator today is NAMEPA's board member, Niels Allen, who is also vice president of the West Gulf Maritime Association. So Niels, take it away, and we've got a great panel coming.
Yes, we do, Carly. And I would like to thank you, Carleen, your staff, and the volunteers that have put together yet another great seminar. I am indeed proud to serve on the board and have actively participated in many of the NAMEPA programs and had the pleasure of hosting some of them in Houston. We do have 4 great panel speakers today. Their bios are in the seminar link. If you have not done so, please take time to review their bios so we don't have to go through that now. As been mentioned by Joe, Randy, Carleen, there's been a number of disruptions and changes in not only the maritime industry, but our personal life with the ongoing pandemic. It is no surprise that our industry is going through a massive period of disruption. We are constantly bombarded with new technologies and practices for approaching the next wave. Before we do that, it is important, though, that we know where we are today. Another big disruption, last month we saw the transition of power in this country, excuse me, from the 45th President Donald Trump, President Joe Biden. While we are in a global industry, this has had a profound impact on the maritime industry, and we will be fortunate to have Rear Admiral Richard Timmy to share with us what those impacts look like. Another significant event in this year was the IMO's guidelines for cybersecurity. Cynthia Hudson of Hudson Cyber will lead us through what we can expect from IMO 2021 and how it affects our industry. With last year's Golden Ray accident, policies and procedures for Open 90 were challenged. Resolve Marine's Todd Duke will share where we stand on Open 90 response and are there changes to be anticipated going forward. Finally, Dana Merkel of Blank Rome will provide us with an overview on regulatory challenges we can expect to see as we navigate our disruptive world. So that we can stay on time and move things quickly, I would ask that you please hold your questions to the end. I would prefer that we run a little bit ahead of schedule than behind. Our first presenter today will be Rear Admiral Richard Timmy with the U.S. Coast Guard. He is Assistant Commandant for Prevention Policy. His update will be the impact of a new administration on the Coast Guard. Admiral Timmy, you have the screen, sir.
Okay, let's figure out if the technology works. Comms check on.
Gotcha.
Okay, listen, we've been. Let me just start with thank you for the opportunity. We've been in this every call with the technology, so I've had to do triple changes here to what I've got going on here. So I'm down to my iPhone today. So hopefully you can see, and this will work out okay. Hey, it's a pleasure to join you, and a great panel. I've looked through and excited to be part of this with everybody. You'll forgive me if I kind of recalibrate just slightly on the title. You know, I am apolitical in regards to administrations, and we're just going to talk about what we see coming forward here right now for the future, and how we build on what we've been doing in the Coast Guard and with the maritime industry, and how we move into 2021 and beyond, and what that looks like. And I think that it should look fairly similar. I want to start with a recap, though, of 2020. You know, I listened as we talked about the issues of the pandemic and how it's affected us. If you're not familiar with some of the things that we've put into the public policy, just want to highlight those. You know, as the pandemic has continued, we've tried to address where risk is in the marine transportation system. You know, on a daily basis, I drive out risk hopefully through setting a standard, enforcing that standard, and having people comply with it, whether it's about how to train mariners or what your emissions look like or how to build your engine or what the steel thickness is on your hull. All of those standards are designed to remove risk from the system in some way or other. You know, we turned that equation kind of on its head last March as we said, where's the real risk in the system right now? As you saw, you know, foodstuffs and toiletries disappear off the shelves because the supply chain wasn't functioning as we all expected it normally to do so. So there's risk there because most of that supply chain is coming through the Maritime. So we've adjusted this last year really to making sure that that risk was mitigated. And that's been through some of the extensions that we've granted for licensing, for medical certificates. I think we've got a hot mic out there, somebody shuffling papers. So, you know, we extended certificates, we extended training certificates. We changed the way we did face-to-face interaction with the maritime industry. You know, we all wanted to minimize those threat vectors. And so we used, we were speaking earlier of the technology that we're all now much more used to. And some of that technology has been used in the way we do compliance and enforcement out in the field. And we've invested greatly as an organization in that. And I point this out because there will be, I think, a snapback post pandemic. The technology exists, I think, for doing so much more as we interact out there and in a very efficient way. But I don't think the governance on enforcement and compliance with standards is quite there yet, and that we can wash our hands of trying to continue to adjust of how do we do a virtual exam? How can I videotape something in lieu of showing an inspector or an auditor those actual things? There's some governance issues that still exist there, and I think that that's what we're going to focus on moving forward, because certainly the technology now have been the momentum and the bump forward there for sure over the last year. The other thing about technology is as this pandemic has put us in a place to adapt and use it even more is cyber. You know, I got to put in my cyber block. Those are all threat vectors that you now have to deal with, just like you would from any perimeter security standpoint. And I think that's a good way for me as a layperson to continue to think about cyber, my cyber perimeter on the ship or on my OT or my IT systems. We have certainly seen a forward leap in the adaptation of technology tools, both in industry and government. And there remains big concern, look no further than solar winds and what you can read in open source about what that's meaning for both government and industry out there. So looking forward. So yes, new administration. So one of the things that I think I'll point out is that did happen is there's a number of executive orders out. I've got to give my my public service announcements to the EO that deals with mask wear on ships, and so that is good. That's probably where I've spent the majority of my time in the last 3 weeks, and it's been answering questions, different industry associations, as well as with the interagency and with our own Coast Guard field folks on what does it mean. And pending your questions later on, I'll just tell you right now, wear the mask. That's the most simple thing I can tell you if you're on a ship or on a port. The expectation is, from a public health perspective, to wear the mask. There's been lots of talk about enforcement. You know, TSA is, you know, are they writing tickets? Are they not writing tickets? What are we going to do if you're not wearing the mask? Again, all that gets answered by wear the mask. Operators of the conveyances are responsible for ensuring their passengers and folks are wearing masks. And if we have to get to a point where we're talking about enforcement and compliance, then we'll do that. I think we'll usually have that conversation first with the operator rather than an individual. But in the end, the mask wear by anybody is required for that CDC order. I would say happy to take more questions on that. I'm really not, but I will if you want to. It's just where I've been talking for most people for the last few weeks. We talked about order books and yard availability, and briefly we talked about ballast water systems and what that did. You know, we've done a number of extensions, but I don't think an inordinate amount based on the impact that we did see out in the field. I think we're at about 1,100 short-term extensions that I would attribute to kind of this COVID impact across the fleet. But that will continue to be, I know, something that we are on a regular basis interacting with the major carriers on. We've got by 2024, we're looking at 90% of the folks out there having that ballast water system in one of the compliant systems. We have 40 type approved at this point from where we sit. And so continue to get progress there. I'll tell you another thing that's kind of happened over the last year here is really interesting is the voluntary use of electronic record books out there that will include oil record books moving forward. So lots of discussion here with our compliance partners at Department of Justice, with the Department of State, with our own investigators to make sure that as we move forward, we are incorporating the examination of that electronic record book just like we would a paper record book to make sure that we have addressed the compliance issue that I think we did a really good job, not a really good job with, but I think we did okay with. The magic pipe issue, the discharge issues. Let me see your record book and let me talk to the chief engineer. We've got to kind of relearn that with the electronic record book and what it means for environmental compliance. So a lot of focus on that with our criminal investigators, our DOJ partners, and our own Port State Control examiners. VIDA, so Vessel Incident Discharge Act. That is one that is affected kind of by the transition from one administration to another. EPA had 2 years that they were looking to create a set of standards for more than nearly 24 discharge streams. We worked with them continually over the last 2 years to get to a place where they were creating a standard that we would have a way to enforce once it came over the transom to us. We have 2 years to create our enforcement kind of framework post EPA's work. But right now, I can tell you that they have kind of taken a reset under the new administration as the appointees come in there. They want to see what EPA had on the books and what it might mean moving forward. So that one's kind of still out there. Our clock hasn't started from a Coast Guard perspective for the creation of that framework since EPA's clock is kind of still running. In general, we have seen that the non-significant rulemakings and other kind of technical fixes that we have in the legislative pipeline are moving forward now, and that anything that was in the pipeline from a more major perspective of a rulemaking like the EPA is getting another look, but that we will feel good moving forward on a number of initiatives that we have. If you look at the Coast Guard Authorization Act that was buried in the NDAA in December, you're going to see a couple of really interesting pieces for us moving forward. One, was the small passenger vessel reform based on a tragedy out in California in fall of 19. But two others. One is a space-focused kind of provision where we're going to look at authorities in the offshore for what we would do there. But lastly and finally, I think most importantly for this discussion is the change on how the Outer Continental Shelf legislation is applied to renewable energy sources. So it means now I've got wind in this portfolio of authorities that we're looking at in the offshore. I've spent a lot of time this year on fairway routes on the East Coast, port access route studies, wind farms in New England and wind farms off the Mid-Atlantic, and that will continue to be a waterways management issue that we're focused on because I do expect that BOEM is looking at relooking at just I think almost 18 current applications for wind projects and what that will mean for both waterways traffic, for Jones Act traffic, for offshore. I think you see that focused on the president's EO on climate change and what it means for renewables. So I really ran through that quick. I would be happy to. One other piece I'll tell you that we're working with IMO and have from the beginning, not to a satisfactory solution, but we open here talking about the effect of this pandemic on maritime and shore leave and crew changeouts, and that has still not been fixed. Early on, we were able to put out a policy letter from our perspective on what we wanted to see for crew changeouts, and the fact that we expected that shore leave here in this country was not going to be taken away arbitrarily. There's still controls presidentially on coming from the Schengen area or other places, but beyond that, there was not going to be any arbitrary no shore leave imposed. We worked with IMO. They published our letter as part of the best practices, but there's still more work to be done there. I've seen this really become a nation state issue about reciprocity on flights and access, as much as it's been about getting individual mariners home, and that's been complicating the picture. Vaccine priority, vaccine access is something that we continue to advocate for the U.S. Maritime. It is the truth of life at sea or on vessels that you are away from your home for weeks to months at a time. So to be expected to get back to your home state, which is the only place you'll be eligible to get a vaccine, is going to be real tough and a disadvantage that maritime workforce. And so we've been advocating for that along with MARAD and Transcom through the department and the administration as they relook at seaports and what the maritime means in this pandemic. So, barring your questions or looking forward to your questions, I'll let the next speaker go.
Admiral Timmy, thank you for that very informative presentation. And I mentioned that we were going to hold questions and comments till the end, but as moderator, I'll slide in a positive comment. Thank you personally for your accessibility and for the Coast Guard's accessibility and the open dialogue. It's valued by the industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Our second presenter today is Cynthia Hudson. She is CEO Hudson Analytics. I've had the pleasure of knowing Cynthia for many years, and I've heard her speak live and in person. She's a great speaker, very knowledgeable. Her presentation today will be IMO 2021 and other cyber challenges. Cynthia, you have the screen, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Niels. It's a pleasure to be here for NAMEPA, an organization that is doing so much good for protecting the marine environment. And I think one of the few organizations that has actually been able to connect the operations that we all face with how do we work together. We can stop working, but how do we work together to protect the marine environment? So my congratulations to Carleen and the very fine board of directors, on which I'm proud to participate. So I'm here to talk to you about cyber, and some of you have heard me speaking about cyber before and are probably thinking, oh, not again. But we're going to try to face what's new here, what you need to know now. And I think if I can say, we're moving a bit from the philosophical, in other words, understanding the world of cyber, into, all right, what do we need to do and why? So next slide, please. I just want to tell you who we are. We are in this space as a service provider. We don't own technology per se, and that means that we can look at what's available in the marketplace and try to steer you to right solutions. The thing we've added this year is tailored cyber threat intelligence, which is giving us a real good opportunity to help people understand what the threats are to their organizations and how to protect themselves. And we do some other things too, but let's go forward into our topic, which is, I think, really, and by the way, I think it's amazing that I am following a fantastic Coast Guard Admiral on his iPhone. That's a very tough act to follow. So the maritime cyber risk landscape now is evolving. Of course, we understand that we've used technology in a dramatically different way during 2020 for obvious reasons. But what we sometimes forget is that life is moving in this direction, particularly in the world of port and maritime, anyway, and for very, very clear reasons. So if we call it the digitalization of port operations, it's clear that everything is becoming interconnected, which is why I like this slide. It really does show you the umbrella of connectivity that really includes our port environment. Well, what about the vessels? Are they part of the port community? I think the answer now is a move away from fragmentation into real communications, because communications digitally are affording us efficiency, flexibility, agility. All those things will relate, of course, to cost benefits, but will also relate to environmental improvements. Just-in-time port arrivals are going to reduce the length of time a vessel spends in a port, which means that the opportunity for an accident, for example, will diminish. The opportunity for different types of emissions can be overall managed in a different way. And so this is here to stay. And we think that this is going to be information continuously that will be shared with operators and, in fact, all of the port community, all stakeholders. So this is where we're going. Next slide, please. So this time last year and the year before, we were trying to say to ourselves as an industry, what is cyber? We don't get it. We don't understand it. Now we are here already. We have the guidelines and regulations in place for many quarters to first of all, realize we must do something. And second of all, to do it appropriately. How do we approach it? How do we qualify and quantify the risks that we have? There's guidance, and many of you that are on the vessel side understand that this guidance basically ties what we're doing to your safety management systems. These organizations are all coming out or have come out with information, regulations, or guidelines. And of course, you know, the Coast Guard is not on here, but the Coast Guard itself has come forward with, let's say, a little bit more than guidance and a little bit less than a full-blown regulation to help the vessel owner community to face this risk. But mostly we are looking at what IMO is doing, and that's because it seems to centralize what it is that we all have to face under one umbrella. So now we have got the direction and we can begin to organize. What do? We're a shipping company. How do we face it? Well, number one, we know we have to meet the regulation. But I think that what has maybe been missed is that the risk management principles we are all being measured by within our ISM systems have to be applied to cybersecurity. This is not small. This is something that we have to face, and it is daunting if we're going to do it right. Next slide, please. I wanted to show you the interconnection, and many of you may have seen this slide that we've put together before. It really explains to you that IMO, and therefore much of the other guidance available, is really functioning on the foundation of the NIST cybersecurity framework. It was then what we thought. It now has come to be. And so when you look at the IMO clauses, the identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover is very much, well, it's almost identically aligned with the NIST cybersecurity framework. And by the way, it also really aligns with most of the other risks in the maritime space that we have to face, from physical security issues to environmental risk. How do we understand what we are about to do? To an actual environmental event, for example, it's exactly the same sort of thing. And so we can understand it. Next slide, please. But what does this all mean? I mean, what does it mean to you? It's one thing to say, oh, you've got to understand it, you've got to do it, you've got to face it. What exactly is it that you now need to do? Well, you know you have to comply with IMO, that's a given. But you really need to think about conducting a risk assessment for your entire company. That has to be done now, and it has to be done at system levels. So this is not just taking your IT department and saying, let's find out what the risks are. All the systems within the organization have to be looked at, and looked at in conjunction with one another. Then you need to think about going about patching outdated software. Now, I know none of your organizations have outdated software, but if you have a friend who does in fact have some, you might want to recommend that patching that software needs to be done now. How fast does software become outdated? Well, any of you with an iPhone know that you can get an update once a month to 3-4 times a month. That's just an iPhone. We are sitting on fairly sophisticated systems from a vessel side and certainly on a port side. These systems, you'd be amazed at how frequently problems and hacks occur when systems have simply not been patched or updated. Next is to understand what it is you have. This is something that we find quite interesting. When we go into an organization and say, okay, let's have a look at what your assets are. Where's your inventory? And people that are very, very professional within their own areas look at each other and say, do we have an inventory? Who has that inventory? I have one for my department. Do we have a company-wide inventory? You have to know what you have in order to manage it. So a centralized inventory is certainly going to help you. Once you have that asset inventory, then you can start to think about identifying vulnerabilities. Because there are different types of vulnerabilities that exist for different types of systems, you need to know what they are in order to plan to protect that system from an outside attack. Then when you have the vulnerabilities, it's all about planning for that attack. What are you going to do in order to prevent? Yes, but what happens when someone gets through, when a hacker gets through? How do you act? How do you react? What is the decision-making process? Who has the ability to commit resources? Who has the ability to commit money in order to in order to contract those resources? And what is the internal system protocol should something occur? I think people may be going about this in reverse order by trying to make a plan before they've identified what really they have for systems and what really the vulnerabilities are. Okay, so now the group of experts within your company have done all these things, and they look at one another and say, well, we're ready. Well, we might suggest that it's time for training now. If you have a wonderful plan and you know what you're going to do and you have identified resources, it is time now to look and say to ourselves, who needs to be trained on what, on the prevention side and on the response side, and how do we go about doing it? Lastly, it's a situation of monitoring threats. So if we don't know that our company is under attack and by whom, or what information may have already been stolen and is sitting there waiting to be purchased by a nefarious third party, we don't really know what threat we face. And yet we know it in most of the other areas of our business. So the monitoring of threats, we believe, is then key. So now let's go to the next slide. This is the next thing, and I know that all of us are guilty of this. We need to have a system and we need to show that we have it. So we make a very good paper system, and if the paper maybe is electronic or paper, whatever, it's sitting on the shelf. And who looks at it and when? Does it translate into actions? Are the actions prioritized? What can we do and when do we need to go get help? This is a very simple question, but it has to apply to this cyber, say, call it cyber hygiene on the way to cyber maturity. We need to know what needs to be done and what is the step ladder from where we are now to where we want to go in order to achieve an appropriate measure of security. And then to all of our shipping friends, you'll recognize this. It's time then to have a system that supports what we're doing. KPIs are really where it leads to. Do we have the key performance indicators to know what we're doing and why? Are we monitoring our leading and lagging indicators? What's going on and how do we have visibility and transparency in order to know that we're managing our systems appropriately? Next slide, please. These are the down-to-earth business challenges. All of this requires your money, your time, personnel, skill sets, and leadership. Maybe leadership should be first, because leadership needs to commit to each of the other areas. Leadership is not saying, we have a very good IT guy, get him in here and tell him to fix this. That doesn't work, and I think that it's pretty clear now that this cuts across all systems. Next, please. There are industry resources that are available to you, like the slide that I showed you earlier. There are also possibly internal resources, depending on the size and shape of your company and the experience that your folks in the technology and IT departments have. So we are not discounting of internal resources, and we're certainly not discounting that you can get some guidance and help from industry organizations. You certainly can. And then you have legal counsel, and certain of the very good law firms have developed a little bit cyber specialization, particularly to help you in the event of a cyber hack. And what exactly are the steps then to assist you if you have, God forbid, let other people's information out on the web. Your insurer, if you are having a degree of business interruption insurance or cyber insurance or both, may also offer some resources in the way of steady information, but also in the way of supporting you should there be an unfortunate breach. But then to get the job done, in order to get ready and hopefully prevent a hack, and beyond that, to maintain your system so that you really are IMO compliant, you're going to need service providers of different types. Now, this sounds self-serving. Yes, we're consultants in this area, but there are many service providers that can be utilized to very good effect, rather than you going out and hiring people that have a degree of expertise, but maybe not everything you'd like. You're going to need them, and it's better to identify them now. They also may be needed in the event of a breach, but I'll talk about that later. The next area, which I think you're going to see a real explosion in, is information sharing and analysis. There is now a Maritime ISAC that is beginning to get its traction, located in Florida. We're happy to be working with them. But the idea is to gather information that is anonymized and non-competitive, that can be shared across the playing field in order for you to understand what others are doing and to understand what others are facing, and thereby help your own organization. There are threat intelligence services that can help to tell you what is going on a steady basis, directly involving your company and your types of systems and software. So it's a bit double-hatted. You would like to know if someone has the personal data from your accounting department, or the financial data from your accounting department, and is shopping that data. But you'd also like to know if the software that is operating your systems, or the systems themselves, are now being consistently under attack out on the dark web in cyberspace. Next is what happens when you actually have a problem. We've put together a cyber response organization because we feel that the model, not the Open 90 exact model, because it doesn't apply, there isn't a similar regulation, but we believe the model is effective. We believe that having a response capability that's already integrated in advance with your organization will help you when you need it, and hopefully not require 3 weeks for you to figure out how to put one together. And I'd say there are some assistance in many government agencies, both local and also federal. And we can help you to navigate that, but that's a longer conversation. But use these resources in order to get yourself moving. Next slide, please. This is where we're going. And this is a simplistic slide because it looks like one giant Zoom call. But the fact of the matter is, data is going to be shared, and meetings are going to be for different reasons than they once were. Maybe they'll be hybrid, but the information sharing and the port digitalization and the maritime community that is going to be integrated with that really is here to stay. So we hope that this will give you something to think about, but also simply enough give you some tools or some ways to think about facing it. Our next slide is just who we are. These are the things we're doing. I mentioned the threat assessment tool, and that is called Cyber Helm in the last, and that it seems to be quite interesting right now for certain of our clients who say, this could be helpful. Next slide. That's it for me. I hope that you found it helpful. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you, Cynthia. It was very interesting and helpful, and I had lots of questions, but I'll hold off till we have the open session at the end. Our third speaker is Mr. Todd Duke. He's head of compliance for Resolve Marine. His presentation will focus on the current state of OPA 90 response posture and the U.S. Salvage perspective. Todd, you have the screen, sir.
Good morning, everyone, or I guess good afternoon. I'm out in Anchorage, Alaska, so it's still morning for us, but I'm very honored to be on a panel with such distinguished speakers. I don't know how Salvage got on there, but here we are. I want to talk a little bit about, next slide, please, the current state of OPA 90 response posture in the United States from a Salvage perspective. Next slide, please. So after the Exxon Valdez OPA 90 was established to cover all captain port zones, primarily with oil spill response capabilities. Salvage was briefly mentioned to have on scene within 24 hours, and primarily salvage were regional providers with over 450 different organizations being named in vessel response plans. You know, OPA 90 encompasses many of those services of oil spill response, salvage, marine firefighting. From a salvage perspective, our goal is to protect the environment and life at sea through early interventions using salvage techniques and vetting of providers, or as I like to say, keeping the oil inside the ship. In 2009, salvage marine firefighting was eventually properly addressed to address the core functions of the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. And salvage decided to compete and cover all of these all of the captain port zones. Next slide, please. So often the first question is, what is salvage? Salvage operations are any act or activity undertaken to assist a vessel or other property that's in danger in the navigable waters or any other waters. Vessels may mean any ship or craft or any structure capable of navigation, and property means any property not permanently or intentionally attached to the shoreline and includes freight at risk. And damage to the environment means substantial physical damage to the human health or the marine life or resources in coastal or inland waterways, or the adjacent areas there too, caused by pollution, contamination, fire, explosion, or similar major incidents. Container vessels are a very much growing concern for our industry, and the environment. As you've been reading in the press lately, there's been several thousand containers wound up in the Pacific Ocean due to excessive stacking. The gentleman from Jefferies mentioned how what I call the Amazon effect of people being stuck in their houses, and so they're sitting there on Amazon buying things. It's all coming from Asia via ships in containers, and container capacity is extremely tight. This is causing shippers to stack containers higher and higher, and the lashings break, and we wind up with containers in the ocean. Many times the contents of these containers can be much more toxic than oil actually hitting the water. So it's something. And if you have a vessel that's grounded, next slide, please. A vessel that's grounded or that needs to be lightered, it oftentimes there's not crane capacity in most areas of the country to reach those top stacks, as you saw in that previous picture of some of our guys using high wire mountain climbing gear to reach the top of the container stacks in order to lighter these things. So who are some of the players? Unified Command includes government and incident commanders, Coast Guard, harbor masters, environmental authorities, port state control, the ship owner, and from the owner, the QI or qualified individual, technical managers, charters, and cargo, and then the people who ultimately pay for this, the hull and machinery and protection and indemnity, and occasionally wreck removal, pollution, and cargo insurers. And then the contractors, the salvers, the oil spill response organizations, spill management teams, and not to be left out, more importantly sometimes is the other stakeholders, such as tribal organizations, non-governmental organizations, who are representing the marine life, you know, the birds and the whales and the other things that don't necessarily have a voice, so we have to speak for them. And we appreciate working together as effectively as possible. It's important that we know each other before an incident occurs, that everyone works well together, because in the case of an incident, this is not the time to meet for the first time. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the Salvage Marine Firefighting Rule was finally passed in 2009. Oil spill response organizations, salvage marine firefighters were actually given, next slide please, more time frames, stricter time frames as to when they need to have resources and what types of resources available to the vessel, instead of just show up in 24 hours. Over the past 10 or so years, there's been a real push to activate vessel response plans in a timely manner, and gave some time frame requirements for that. All of these services we have to adhere to, and these how we're going to continue to respond under a new way of giving things away. I'm sorry. So pardon me, I got my notes out of whack. So next slide, please. So what's happened in the salvage industry recently? So in 2012, Spitzer entered the OPA 90 market, and started giving away services for free. And this another provider also pushed the non-tank market down with 5 years of free coverage. So how can multiple providers benefit from zero profit and the large cost of assets and overhead and personnel? Casualties where the profit is in this industry, obviously, but prevention is what's needed, because our goal is to protect the environment. So low prices have still drove down as new entities emerged, and then eventually several organizations merged together. The Spitzer Titan MRA dropped from the market and consolidated in 2015 to a company called Ardent. In the middle of the COVID crisis, Ardent could no longer sustain itself and dropped out of the market. And now you have 3 primary salvage marine firefighting providers. This is previously unsustainable pricing, so much that Ardent left the industry, and we must continue to reinvest in assets and have larger and larger overhead, so it doesn't make for a very attractive market. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we need to make sure is both from protection of the environment and also from a salvage perspective, in order to keep us adequately capitalized, is to ensure that salvage marine firefighting activation takes place early. A BRP must be activated once the vessel masters determine that onboard resources and personnel cannot meet the needs of an actual or potential incident. This is generally done via contacting the QI, and alternate QIs activates as part of the vessel response plan. QI then assesses, and through consultative services, the VRP may or may not be activated. One of the things that we suggest, next slide please, is that you know, we are activated early as possible, and therefore have a professional assessment done, and then we will roll resources as required. Give you an example here. This was a vessel fire that we did earlier this summer. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the Jacksonville Fire Rescue Department was notified of an incident, a major incident that almost 2.5 hours later, the resolve was notified by the QI, and at 18:30 we were actually activated, and the salvage master started. At 18:54 we had a fire assessor team on site, and started conducting fire assessments in order to determine what needed to be taking place. Next slide, please. We immediately engaged our local GSA tug assets with firefighting capability, and we mobilized specialized portable equipment from various response depots: Fort Lauderdale, Theodore, Alabama, New Orleans, Charleston, South Carolina, and Jacksonville, Florida. One may ask, why do we mobilize resources from all these different locations? So the salvage and marine firefighting regulation says that you have to be able to have a firefighting flow of 0.16 gallons a minute for 20 minutes. That in order to extinguish a vessel fire, and this comes from some firefighting literature that deals with refinery firefighting and foam flows. But anyway, so that works out to be 1,002 gallons a minute for 20 minutes is what the regulation states. And in fact, we flowed 51,500 gallons a minute for 3 days to get this fire under control. And then we intermittently flowed for another 4 days as we determined hot spots and what more that we needed to do in order to fully extinguish this fire. And so instead of a 20-minute time frame, it was 7 days before we finally extinguished this fire. I do want to point out, if you see in the back picture there, you'll see those towers in the back. That's Jacksonville Electric Authority, one of their power generation plants. Just outside of the right side of that picture is the loading manifolds where they bring fuel into that plant, and so there's only one way in and one way out to that manifold. And so if we had rolled that vessel over, we would have actually literally taken out one of the entire power generation plants. So having a professional salver on scene with their naval architects, marine engineers, and such to make sure that the ship stays upright and stable and does not block the channel is pretty important. Next slide, please. So we extinguished the fire. We also had a plan to remove the cargo and the pollutants and ensure the vessel was secure and safe for sea. We removed 1,500 tons of heavy fuel oil and 2,420 used vehicles were removed. It was a 24-hour operation with over 40 people engaged at most of the time. As I stated, the fire was in a major operating port for container operations and ro-ro operations, as well as the Jacksonville Electric Authority. And then, of course, this was right in the middle of COVID. And COVID has caused us all salvers a bit of an issue. You know, and we have salvers located all over the world, and a lot of times we pick our teams based on the type of incident that's occurring. And so, you know, we have specialists that we will pull from different regions of the country or the world, and that's just not available as it used to be in COVID times, because we can't travel as freely as we once could. So it's a bit of an issue, and handling it with all of these people on the scene. We would keep people in pods and keep them together. They stayed in hotels together. They ate together. You know, because we couldn't we couldn't socially distance a lot of times and that sort of thing. So we kept people in small pods. We tested every 7 days, temperature checks every morning and every evening at the safety meetings, and constantly kept an eye on people for various symptoms. I'm happy to report that we did not have a COVID outbreak during this incident. So that was pretty spectacular. Some of our key concerns beyond the commercial status of the market and lack of retainer fees being charged includes vessels using alternative energy. As you know, you read in the local press, Green New Deal, lots of alternative energy such as hydrogen or LNG powered as the main propulsion fuel, or battery operated or something like that. We don't have a very comfortable feeling of what we're going to do with some of these ships. And you know, there is a fuel quantity limit on the OPA 90. You could essentially take an LNG powered ship, and if you kept your lube oils at a low enough level, OPA 90 doesn't apply to an LNG powered ship, even though it may be 10,000 gross tons. And so will there be a mechanism to deal with a maritime emergency? So that's one of the things that we are considering and looking at. The IMO 2020 fuels are causing some issues, and there's been several incidents across the world as a result of that. I was just in discussions with one of the pilots here in Cook Inlet just the other day. Their pilot cards, they're not getting the amount of horsepower that the pilot card says when they're coming in, and so due to these new fuels, and so it's something that needs to be addressed, these unintended consequences. So anyway, that's my report.
I have to turn the mute off. Thank you. Good job, Todd. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our fourth and final presentation in this session will come from Dana Merkel. She's with Blank Rome. Her presentation is entitled Regulatory Challenges in a Disruptive World. Dana, you have the screen, and welcome to the seminar.
Thank you, Nils, and thanks to NAMEPA for bringing us together for this event, virtually at least. I'm looking forward to seeing you all in person at an event in the not too distant future. In terms of regulatory challenges over the past year, many pre-pandemic challenges have remained, though some have become even more complex due to COVID-related restrictions. The pandemic has also presented a number of new challenges. I'm going to touch on some of the updates and issues that I and the rest of our Blank Rome Maritime Regulatory Group have been spending a lot of time on recently on behalf of vessel owners and operators. Generally, these fall into two categories: regulatory changes and compliance, and then issues specifically related to COVID. As Rear Admiral Timmy noted, one regulatory area that's slowly progressing is implementation of the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, VIDA. Once implemented, this will replace the EPA's VGP and a number of Coast Guard regulations for ballast water. The first step in this process was completed just this past year. EPA developed its performance standards for marine pollution control devices to manage vessel incidental discharges. It was published on October 26th with a very short 30-day comment period, especially considering the notice was over 300 pages. So that was a quick turnaround for a lot of us. As Rear Admiral Timmy noted, it's now been delayed. It was supposed to be finalized by December 4th, and it's now on hold for review by the new administration. A few of the key points of the standards: the same 27 standard discharges that were covered under the VGP are included. They're just reorganized into 20 discharge categories. The VIDA extends jurisdiction out to 12 nautical miles, not 3 as it was under the VGP. And there were two areas that were of particular concern for the industry: discharges of scrubber wash water and management of ballast water. The EPA adopted IMO standards for scrubbers and wash water, and also maintained IMO standards for wash water, which was a relief to many. Just like the VGP, the states will still have an opportunity to mandate state-specific requirements. And once this final rule is published, the Coast Guard will then start its clock for its 2 years. Thus, we're still a few good years out from full implementation. We also anticipate litigation with respect to EPA's performance standards, as many environmental groups are very unhappy with the proposed standards and believe they should be much stricter. We've even received a number of emails criticizing our, what we consider to be just the facts articles on VITA for not taking a strong stance. Also, as Rear Admiral Timmy noted, e-record books are now allowed for MARPL records as of just over a year ago. And this has been great. It's especially great in COVID because it's been difficult to monitor vessel compliance through COVID with the lack of travel, less superintendent visits and audits, and a lot of these systems allow the Home Office to see the records at any time. Another recent change is legislation that was passed as part of the National Defense Authorization Act last month, and it amends OXLA and confirms the coastwise laws apply to all offshore energy development on the OCS, not just oil and gas, such as wind farms. Whether the coastwise laws apply to offshore wind developments had long been a gray area, though we've always advised our clients to comply with the coastwise laws as if they did apply, because we speculated that U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which interprets and enforces the coastwise laws, would interpret them as applying to offshore wind. The new language clarifies this applicability. Nonetheless, the first rulings that CBP has issued addressing offshore wind development have outlined interpretations that varied from prior rulings addressing oil and gas. Thus, there's still some gray areas that need to be clarified with respect to offshore wind. Strict enforcement of environmental regulations under MARPL and the VGP has continued through the pandemic. We're seeing continued enforcement of Annex 1 involving oil, Annex 5 garbage, and Annex 6 air emissions. And I personally have been spending a lot of time on Annex 6 issues, such as fuel compatibility, NOx emissions compliance, and use of scrubbers. COVID has certainly not slowed enforcement, though investigations do seem to move at a bit faster pace now. We've been dealing with crew issues more than we ever have before. As many people have mentioned, crew changes are very challenging right now, and extended contracts and time on board have resulted in mental health issues for crew. Travel that was once commonplace now requires increased coordination, communication at various levels with ports, agents, government agencies, and airlines. We've been involved in coordinating travel of crew members suffering negative mental health issues on board, returning crew home to ill family, and even transporting deceased crew members from their vessels to home countries, which is particularly challenging right now, as the airlines are refusing to transport them without a lot of coordination. Also, we've long assisted with visa issues for crew, but right now differences in embassy operations through the pandemic and U.S. entry restrictions have resulted in increased difficulty getting crew members to the U.S. to join vessels. It is currently at each embassy's discretion how and what types of visa applications they'll process. We know of some embassies that still completely refuse to process any visa applications, others that are allowing expediting of crew applications, and then there are others that are processing but very slowly. We know of interviews that are scheduled way out into late 2021 already. For those that have valid visas already, current presidential proclamations restricting U.S. entry have been a major issue. Crew members are exempted from this entry restriction. However, airlines and U.S. points of entry have been inconsistent in what they require as proof of applicability. And one of the things that we've been doing that's been a huge help is drafting either for the company or from us strong support letters. And we found that to be critical in ensuring smooth travel here to the U.S. CDC has also imposed restrictions on vessel operations. The cruise industry has been the most impacted as they have effectively been prevented from operating in the U.S. Early on in the pandemic, CDC issued a no-sail order for cruise ships, which was extended several times. On October 30th, it was replaced with a framework for conditional sailing. The framework does set a process for cruise ships to receive a conditional sailing certificate and resume limited cruising. However, CDC has yet to provide the guidance needed for them to complete that process. And considering the steps that still need to be done, especially conducting simulated voyages, it's going to take at least a few months after CDC issues that guidance for the process to be completed. And even then, there are a number of logistical challenges to overcome. Cargo vessels haven't been as impacted by the CDC restrictions. Take note, though, that as the Rear Admiral mentioned again, last month CDC issued an order requiring wearing of masks on all vessels, and that was then followed by a U.S. Coast Guard Marine Safety Information Bulletin, stating that failure to wear a mask creates an undue safety risk, and vessels that have not implemented the requirement may be issued a Captain of the Port order and possibly civil or criminal penalties. And just this week, actually, I heard of penalties being issued for violation of that mask requirement on vessels. The final issue I want to touch on as being a significant challenge in the midst of this pandemic is compliance monitoring and internal investigations. Due to precautions during the pandemic and travel restrictions, ship visits by superintendents and auditors are being canceled, inspections are being delayed, and crew training both on board and at training centers is being missed. This is posing challenges for ship owners in compliance assurance, crew training and readiness, and investigation of non-compliance and near misses that do occur. Particularly considering enforcement has not been hampered by COVID, we strongly encourage ship owners to use whatever virtual methods are available to continue to review compliance, conduct trainings, and when needed, compile documents and photos, and speak with crew members when incidents do occur. And this is where those e-logs can be particularly helpful. I'm sure many of you, like myself, are getting very burned out on these Teams and Zoom meetings, but these preventative and corrective measures can go a long way in avoiding larger enforcement issues. And that wraps up my update. Thanks, and I'm going to hand it back to Niels.
Thank you, Dana. You got through a lot of good stuff very quickly. We appreciate that. We're running a little over, but we did want to open it up for some Q&A. First comment I'd like to make is our doorkeeper and time master, Carlene, will break in when we need to go to the official break. So we'll go ahead and get started with, does anybody have a question for one of our panelists? I had one. Cynthia, I'm a layperson. Can you explain, you mentioned something that was interesting, cyber insurance. Typically, what does that cover and what doesn't it cover for the layperson?
Well, that should take our seminar topic for tomorrow. But I will try to shorten it up a little bit. There are elements of cyber breach insurance in many regular business policies, and it will sometimes cover damages related to you having released, even though it wasn't your fault, you have released data of someone else's. Think about it in terms of, say, HIPAA or employee records, and someone has been able to steal them and get them out onto the web. There is insurance available for those sorts of things. There is other insurance available for cyber breach response. So you've had a breach and it's expensive. I mean, think about a small company with something quite large and permeating all its system. It will have had business losses, failure with its charterer, for example. It will have possible, sadly, danger to seafarers, possible breaches where you have released others' data, all the way down to equipment issues, damage to existing equipment or systems, which also need to be repaired. So the amount of money from where you are now and the damage you've suffered all the way up to getting yourself back in business, some of these will, insurance policies will provide some degree of cyber breach legal support. Other times you've got to get it yourself. And there are lots of other elements. And so there is not a one size fits all. We believe the industry will start to mature in its treatment, and underwriters will develop an appetite that is focused and more aligned with what the operators need. And so that's to us where it's going.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Lindsay,
Neil?
yeah, I saw
Oh.
that Lindsay with American Salvage Association had a question for Admiral Timmy.
Hi, thank you so much. That was a very interesting panel, and thank you so much, Admiral Timmy, and to all the presenters. There was an interesting point put across, even though that was so much information from everybody in a short amount of time, and that blows my mind how this gets to be done virtually. So definitely kudos to NAMEPA and all the panelists, of course. You had mentioned, Admiral Timmy, how to apply virtual vetting when we really need on-site audits, and I think is on behalf of the American Salvage Association that this is something that we look for, actually vetting the providers, actually going out and seeing demonstration of equipment, and we'd like to see higher standards for us as well. What do you see the future of that being underneath the COVID regime, considering that it's gone on for so long? What are the next steps for you as the U.S. Coast Guard?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll tell you that although you didn't ask, I think it's part of the answer, which is, our own workforce has to first grapple with the impact of the pandemic and the new tools. I would say here at Coast Guard headquarters, you're still only at about 30% of the workforce is actually in the building. And that's a high number, I think, in the federal government. I think a lot of agencies just aren't back at all. In the field, we have asked, and our folks are back, at a much higher rate. So that's the first part of the equation. I got to have a workforce that's available to go out and do the in-person vetting. And I think we're most of the way there. But secondly is that, we have become better at using these remote tools and or changes in policies for frequency of interaction. I think that the frequency of interaction is simply, we'll readjust that as we feel more comfortable about, interacting with people. The vaccines in arms, there's a less transmission rate, and we're quote unquote back to normal whenever that happens. But where we have allowed the use of virtual or video presentation for evidence of compliance, I think we're going to have to step back, and I think there will be a retraction in certain places because so much of the attention that has been on the regulatory scheme that I'm responsible for is about accountability, and that means of third parties often. It means accountability of my own performance in the field. And we don't have the data management tools in place or the governance policies in place yet to say, how do you archive a virtual inspection? How am I going to prove to the auditor, do what you say what you do, be able to prove it? How do I now build out that new scheme? That's probably the next place we have to put attention to before we got more comfortable with saying, hey, you know what? Just send me a video of your boat drill and we'll call it good. We're not there yet. I still want to see hands-on. I think there's value in that. But I do think there is a place for it moving forward. There's a place for it where it's appropriate as a tool. And I think that as we recover into our whatever post-pandemic mode looks like, and I have more than 20% of my workforce here to assist with, the creation of new policies and new data management skills, we'll get there. So.
Well, thank you very much, Admiral, and thank you to our panelists in our first panel, and especially to our moderator, and also Randy Givians, who is exploring our marine operations world. We're running a little bit late, so we're going to break now for 10 minutes, not 15, and we'll resume at 2:50 Eastern Time. And if you don't need to dash and you want to see what we've got, some break entertainment, we want to, of course, thank all of our sponsors, ABS and the American Club and Blank Rome and Dorian and DNVGL, and Hudson Analytics and Fairfield Chemical Carriers and Purify Fuel and Smith and Scorpio and Resolve and West Gulf Maritime Association. But we also want to show you some information about NAMEPA. One of the things that you are going to be seeing is a video that we produced at the end of last year, which is sort of a recap of what we did last year. And then immediately after that, we're going to show you a Meet NAMEPA video, which describes a little bit of who we are and what we do. And then, of course, I'm going to be banging the drum yet again for you to vote early and vote often for NAMEPA's submission for the Innovation Award for Green for Sea, and we'll have the link in the chat. But it was a great, great start to our marine operations event. And after the break, we'll be coming back to the next panel, which is going to be where do we need to go, followed by what tools do we need to get there. So thank you again to our first panelists and to our moderator, Neil Zollin.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Carleen.
Oh, I've just learned we're still loading, so I can talk forever. For those of you who aren't familiar, one of the big things that we had in 2020, which I have to say was the most prolific year that NAMEPA has ever experienced. So in terms of, yes, there were some limitations, particularly getting into the field and being physical, but we had opportunity to create a lot of great programs, including our CSR ESG program, and also our new PODS, Planet and Ocean Discovery series. So we've been busy, even if we've been virtual. So thank you. Beth? I've just been informed by Cecilia that I can talk some more. In addition to being able to get the community together, we've still been able to do some of our field work with students. In fact, this Saturday, we'll be doing a beach cleanup with a local school. And we're looking forward to, in a COVID-friendly fashion, being able to educate them about how to clean up and what their responsibility is. This is a high school nearby. And what their responsibility is to the marine environment. We're also getting involved in a lot of national and international organizations surrounding marine education, getting involved with harbor schools, getting involved with more. So here we go, and we're ready for our video.